Hey there, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the New Blocks, episode 4. Kevin, another week has gone by, and today we are going to talk a little bit more about the blockchain. We're going to go another step deeper. We're going to talk about this foundation layer beneath us and this really cool technology that has created all of this commotion and making this podcast worth doing. But first up, how are you? We've got some news in the Bitcoin world, yes?
Yes, indeed. Some pretty big news. Tesla just bought $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin today.
Pretty good.
Yeah,
It's a
that
good
was
haul.
a little bit of a surprise, but also, not entirely. Elon's been tweeting about this for a little while. What did you think of that?
Yeah, so I like you said, not completely surprising with all this Dogecoin stuff. And as Bitcoin was rising in price on this recent run up towards or past 40,000, 30,000, I saw a lot of people tweeting at Elon asking, why can't I buy a Tesla with Bitcoin? You're such a proponent of it. Why can't we use it like regular money? So I think that's a fair criticism. And maybe this is the first step for Tesla to actually make good on that. So pretty exciting stuff, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Tesla also wasn't the first company to make a pretty big move of putting a decent amount of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. There's a company called MicroStrategy. The CEO, Michael Saylor, has recently been tweeting Elon about this in particular. It was a couple weeks ago. It's funny that he actually went ahead with it. Yeah, Mike, I mean, I think we're going to get to a point. I've heard rumors. I'm not sure how founded they are that Apple might be doing this next, or at least is
That would be
contemplating
big.
it.
They sell a lot of hardware. That's a
They
big one.
do. Yep. I'm starting to wonder how companies are thinking through this. I mean, it's looking like a little bit of a musical chairs situation. When MicroStrategy bought 1.3 billion dollars worth of Bitcoin, by the time Tesla bought their 1.5, MicroStrategy's initial Bitcoin is now worth about 3 billion. So
Okay.
as new players are entering into this field of adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet, they're doing it at a higher cost. They're getting less Bitcoin for it. And so I
hmm
think we're going to start to see more and more of these companies that are going to start scrambling to, have a decent hedge against the dollar that they have already on their balance sheets.
Very interesting, man. It's so cool that, we're trying to keep these episodes focused on these contained topics, but while we're doing this, there's all this cutting edge news coming out that we want to talk about. So, nice that there's still a relevant application to all the stuff we're discussing here. But what are we really talking about today? What is this next level of the blockchain that we need to understand, big guy?
Yeah, I think it's important to do another separate episode about blockchain in particular because I think to fully understand or to just like understand it a little bit more will lend itself well moving forward in the series. As we're talking about other currencies with other networks and other blockchains, I think just having that sort of low level understanding of what's happening when we talk about mining, how a transaction goes from just your application on your phone to the blockchain. I
Mhm.
think these are all helpful things to learn about as you're entering this space.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on some of the big topics that we're going to go into more detail today already. So hopefully this will tie a couple of those loose ends together. Still a few to go, and maybe a few new loose ends created today by the time that we're done. But it seems to all come back to this Byzantine general problem. You keep bringing it up, Kevin. I keep seeing it in our note sheet before every episode. What is this thing, and why the hell is it relevant to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so we mentioned this in the Bitcoin episode, but the Byzantine Generals problem is the first computer science problem that really made blockchain an interesting revolution. And so the reason it's called the Byzantine Generals problem is that it's this hypothetical situation where there are these four generals that are commanding four armies, and they're all stationed outside of this city.
Okay.
And their goal is to attack the city. But given the troops that they have, the only way that that attack will be successful is if they coordinate to have all four groups attack the city at the same time. And so the reason that this is a computer science problem is that it goes into sort of a hypothesis or a question of how do you trust the information that you are sending and receiving between the generals. So you can imagine that each general might send out a messenger to each of the other 3 generals and sort of confirm, okay, we're all going to attack on Saturday. How does that work for you? And each general can send their messenger out, and as these messengers are going out around the city, there comes into question whether or not these messengers, as they're returning, can essentially be trusted. If in the process, let's say maybe they have to go through some forests, these messengers get captured by maybe one of the guards from the city and threatened to tell the ally armies a different day, maybe attack on Sunday. That could result in a situation where half of the armies attack on Saturday and half of them, wait till Sunday, resulting in a failure to attack.
So it's all about like receipt of confirmation. If you're sending a message, there's the only scenario where it was received is if a messenger comes back with that receipt. And if they don't come back, they might have gotten the message, they might not have gotten the message. There's all these other scenarios that could be at work. So you don't really know what's happening and if you can rely on all 4 armies to attack at the same time. So this has to do with like transmitting data. It's all about the data transmission. So on the internet, you're sending an email to someone, you want a confirmation that it was received, and you might only know that if they respond. Okay, I see where you're getting at.
And so, and it's a question of not even just like if the messenger doesn't come back, but if the messenger, or in the internet equivalent, if my email goes out and is changed before it gets to the receiver, I don't have any way of knowing that given the existing email protocols.
Okay.
But essentially the whole idea behind this is that if the solution to this problem is that if all of the generals could use a consensus mechanism, such as a blockchain, then they would be able to trust the data that is on display for everyone. And there's sort of this incentive mechanism that's built in place to ensure that the data that lives there is trustable. So the idea of the Byzantine Generals problem is solved by this inception of the blockchain.
Okay. Well, we have some visual tools today to try to work through this. So, very abstract there. Maybe let's talk about the practicality of how this blockchain thing actually works in practice and kind of like what it is. And again, a little bit abstract because we're talking about a digital thing here. So, you have to remember that as we go down this journey.
Yep, exactly. So first off, this is all sort of high level. A blockchain is a timestamped series of immutable records of events that are managed by a peer-to-peer computer network rather than owned by a single entity. And you can see at the bottom here, the reason it's called a blockchain is that you have these blocks of data that are chained together. So in this case, we see 5 blocks. And the idea here is that over time, to add new transactions and new data to the blockchain, you add it to the end and you attach it to the last block.
Okay, so immutable just means like a permanent record, and time-stamped series is that each block is representative of like a chunk of time. Like they flow in the same way time would flow. So
that's correct.
Block 2 is older than block 1. Block 3 is older than or other way around, newer rather. Block 3 is newer.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
You got it. So you can think of the blockchain as an open database that's accessible to anyone in the world. It contains every transaction that's ever occurred in the history of the network. So in this particular block, in block 5, we can see that Alice gave Bob $1 and Charlie gave Denise $20.
Okay.
Except in the blockchain world, nobody really cares about your identity, or at least the blockchain doesn't. So instead of saying that Alice sent Bob $1, the blockchain only knows that address 4EF47 yada yada sent $1 to address 163CD yada yada.
So this is the kind of anonymous aspect of what we're talking about here with cryptocurrency.
That's correct.
Okay. And
so before we continue, let's talk about the life cycle of a blockchain transaction. So let's say I want to send you $10. My wallet application creates a Bitcoin transaction and emits it as a message to the entire network and says, I would like to send $10 to this address. Before that transaction is added to the blockchain, though, it enters what is known as the mempool.
Okay.
And you can think of the mempool as a list of pending transactions waiting for approval by the network.
So it's like a holding room. It's like you're in the waiting room waiting to see the doctor, and the doctor gets to decide if you're good enough to get on the chain. But you're like in limbo right here, where they're deciding whether or not these are legit transactions or some bullshit that a trickster tried to put into the blockchain. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. So this is where miners come in. A blockchain miner has two very important jobs. First, they need to prove that they can be trusted. Bitcoin miners stake massive amounts of electricity in the form of solving cryptographic puzzles. They want to prove to the network that they are willing to risk burning that electricity in the name of their second and most important job, which is validating new transactions on the network. So you can think of that electricity that they're burning, running their crypto mining hardware, as essentially collateral. They're saying, I'm going to put this electricity on the line, and if I lie, if I cheat, if I try to include fraudulent transactions, it will have all been for nothing.
So the miners are using computers to solve cryptographic problems. Like that's what mining is. And this solving of the problems, is that like processing transactions? Is that what that means?
Yeah, so it's not the problems that are being solved are actually not even relevant to Bitcoin. They're not relevant to like anything that is beneficial to the transactions. It is purely a mechanism to ensure that one random miner is selected roughly, in the case of Bitcoin, every 10 minutes. So it's this idea of we need a way that we need something that burns electricity, and we need something that ensures relatively random chance based on the amount of hardware that you're running to dictate the likelihood that any particular miner will be selected to introduce the next.
So
block.
Weird example here, but when I worked in computer repair, one way we would test processors, like do a stress test, is we would run this program called Prime 95 that would just search for prime numbers, and we're talking huge prime numbers, right? So it's just using your processor to max out solving this really, really long, like unsolvable math algorithm, and we're doing it purely just to push the processor to its limit. Is this the same kind of concept where these are just cryptographic? It's a puzzle for the sake of there being a puzzle, so computers have to spend all this electricity to solve the puzzle. That way you can't just come in with your cell phone and go, hey, look, I got a Bitcoin now. Cool, man. You need like a serious processing rig to be able to mine stuff to solve these stupid puzzles. And it's just a barrier put in place so that the network has some... Is delay the right word built into it?
Yeah,
so I feel like I'm like putting layman's terms to this, but
it serves a few purposes. It serves the purpose of a mechanism to burn electricity to be used to stake.
So that's the currency. Yeah.
Yep, the currency essentially, and then it is used. Let's say there's what's called the difficulty curve. This is this idea of how difficult should we make this next puzzle. If tomorrow I spun up 10,000 new Bitcoin miners, that would give me a pretty big advantage. That would introduce a lot of hashing power into the Bitcoin network. But then what Bitcoin would do is it would adjust the difficulty of the puzzle to include that moving forward.
So the more people that are plugged into the network, the harder the puzzles are. So it scales. It's part of this disinflationary kind of shit where it scales to be harder and less efficient the more people use it. So it benefits the early movers by an accelerating rate.
Yes, to some degree. And also, I mean, it's worth noting that these, especially in Bitcoin, these mining rigs, this hardware that's being run is generally expensive, and it improves pretty quickly. So not only is it just about sort of like first movers, but it's also you need to, if you want to get into the Bitcoin mining game, you need to be constantly putting up money to be purchasing the new latest and greatest miners so that you can be competing at sort of the global scale with everyone.
Gotcha. Okay. So sorry for that little derail, but I think that was important.
Good. Yeah. All right. So first, let's continue. We have a miner that just solved the puzzle. They're super excited because they're just about to make a bunch of money.
All right.
To claim their reward, they first must assemble the next block by validating the transactions that are in the mempool. So this miner is only interested in selecting transactions that are not fraudulent because they know that their work will be reviewed. Since the blockchain contains every transaction that has ever occurred, the miner can check Charlie's balance and see that he does not have $5,000 to send to Denise. So in exchange for choosing only valid transactions, the miner is rewarded a small transaction fee for each transaction that is placed in the block. So that means that every single time that I want to send somebody money on Bitcoin, I have to include a small transaction fee that I would then pay to the miner, and the miner earns that.
0.001, 0.008 there. That's the kickback for verifying this is good stuff. Okay.
Yep, exactly. And then in exchange for solving that puzzle first, the network also allows the miner to write themselves essentially a check to pay for the electricity that they've consumed, as well as an added bonus. And they are essentially printing new Bitcoin. They're mining new Bitcoin, and it is entering circulation by via a reward to the miner that mined the next block.
So is it every time a new block gets verified and stamped onto the blockchain, a new Bitcoin is released? Is that like a Bitcoin gets created every time a block gets created?
That is correct, yes. Okay. And so the every 4 years, the amount of new Bitcoin that a miner can essentially write themselves a check for changes. I don't know off the top of my head what it is currently, but so over time, the amount that miner can write themselves a check for diminishes.
Okay, gotcha.
So the miner then emits this new block to the world, allowing the entire network to check the miner's work. If even a single transaction is found to be invalid or fraudulent, the network will reject that block and excommunicate that miner from the network. So do not lie or cheat, you will be caught. Finally, consensus is achieved, the block is approved, and the network begins mining the next block. And so this process continues. New transactions are added to the mempool. Miners are constantly looking for the next puzzle to solve so that they can be the person that puts their the next block into the blockchain. And finally, that brings us to the overall outcome of this system. So we have a system that utilizes economic incentives to reward nodes acting in the best interest of the network. And we have a network that converts decentralization into trust. So I want to talk a little bit more about that final point, this idea of converting decentralization into trust. Okay. Because decentralization isn't a sort of binary concept. There's not just one side or the other side. You're either centralized or you're decentralized, and it also exists across many different axes. Right? The Bitcoin network may be more decentralized in some ways than something like the Ethereum network, and that could be by the number of miners that exists, where those miners exist. If all of the mining is occurring in one country, maybe there are risks of that country, taking over some of the network. But just as a whole, this idea, the blockchain is just this device that will try to convert some decentralization into trust. And so when you have a network that only has 3 miners that's creating new blocks, it's not the most trustable network. You don't really want to have your life savings in transactions when 3 miners are the only ones that are introducing.
So that's part of why Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, has the biggest market cap and has pretty much always been the cryptocurrency that dwarfs all the others, because it was the first, and the bigger it is, the harder it is to attack or crack or get rid of, because it's so decentralized across all these different machines, and it feeds itself as more people create computers that specialize in mining these algorithms. The network gets more computers plugged into it, then the network gets harder to solve, so they create faster computers that solve it better, which makes it get even harder and harder. So this investment feedback loop keeps spinning, well, maybe not endlessly, but for a pretty long period here. And that's I'm starting to see how Bitcoin can increase in value over time. So kind of predictably now looking back, because
Yeah,
it's
the,
yeah.
it's got strong network effects in many different ways. I think
Yes.
it becomes more and more challenging to replace with some, arbitrary something like Dogecoin. Like Dogecoin can still exist, and people can decide if they think it's valuable or not.
Hmm.
Same with Bitcoin, but the difference here is that Bitcoin has established network effects in terms of the network, the miners, the companies that are willing to put it on their balance sheets, people that see it as money. It's sort of established a place, and that first mover advantage has attributed to a huge network
Yeah. And I
effect.
guess one of the other aspects about this that's cool is I don't think people really understand what peer to peer means, because we've thrown that term around so much with file sharing, LimeWire, Napster, peer to peer file sharing. You don't really hear people say that anymore, but I feel like the term is just sort of is bereft of meaning now. And the internet that we live in now is really good at simulating peer to peer stuff that isn't really peer to peer in the truest sense of the definition. It's you send it to a server, somebody owns that server, gets to look at it, analyze it, process it, sell that data, and then it gets to the next the peer on the other side. It goes to this little daisy chain. We're talking about a network where there's no middleman. It's just all peers sending information to each other to verify each other's information, and that is really cool. Real peer to peer on the back end has some advantages.
Yeah,
There's nobody
exactly.
dipping their hand in the cookie jar, taking a cookie out every time you want to send a cookie to your friend.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's something that we've had on the internet for a while. Like you mentioned, like BitTorrent. We've had this concept of peer-to-peer data exchange, but we haven't, applied that to this concept of doing that in a way that can also ensure trust exists in it.
Yeah.
And so that's why a lot of times you'll hear when people talk about what if the United States decides to ban Bitcoin. Well, what if they decide to ban internet piracy? Right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
can decide that, but what are they actually
How do
going
you
to
enforce it?
do? How do you
Yeah.
enforce that? Exactly. So yes, this architecture, the internet is almost always built in this client server relationship. And if you replace all of the servers with just more clients, just clients talking to clients, it's really hard to affect to
Effectively get
censor.
rid of it. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
That is one of the aspects of this sort of decentralization. It doesn't exist on one server that you can pull the plug on. You can't pull the plug on millions of computers in any real scalable, tangible way. But
Yeah.
is it time for
So
some lightning round action, Kevin? Is that
yeah,
where
I
we're
think
at now?
I think we should jump into some lightning round questions.
All right. What do we
So
got?
I'm going to ask you the first one. Can a blockchain be centralized? If I created my own blockchain tomorrow, how would it differ from me just creating a database?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it definitely can become a marketing buzz term. We saw this a lot in the esports space with tournament bracketing software. It's on a blockchain. This is decentralized tournament software. It's like, yeah, but who is the centralized force that we benefit from decentralizing from? Nobody. There's a lot of fine bracket soft. This data is not protected. This doesn't solve anything. The fact that you've put it on a blockchain that's on your private server is more of a novelty than anything else. It doesn't have any of the aspects that we really just described of why blockchain is valuable when applied to a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. So absolutely, like any other technology, now that it exists, it can be reverse engineered. You and I could make our own blockchain, but if you and I own the whole blockchain and it's on our server and you have to interface exclusively with us to put data on the blockchain or take it out, that doesn't really provide any decentralized value. So it's the way it's implemented alongside the technology that makes it decentralized. But I think we'll see this kind of stuff like banks, for example, or governments putting stuff on blockchain is cool implications for the technology, but not for the folks that are into this, for the decentralization, the anarchists, so to speak.
Yeah.
Blockchain
Yeah.
can be used for bad too.
Yeah, like we said earlier, a blockchain converts decentralization into trust. So if you just start with a centralized blockchain, you're not going to end up with a lot of trust from that. And that's sort of the
Yes.
whole value proposition of a blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. Good follow up there, bud. So, what happens when consensus fails? You talked about that part where everybody agrees and the new block gets minted. Well, what happens if they don't agree?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in different networks, there are different failure scenarios. In the Bitcoin network, there's what's called a 51% attack, which means that if 51% of the Bitcoin mining hashing power is owned or coerced or co opted into a malicious intent, then they have sort of an elevated privilege over what an individual miner would be able to do. And so, some of the things that, so if, let's say, in a hypothetical scenario, 51% of the mining occurred in China, and China were somehow able to, enforce a law that gives them access to all of those miners. They would be able to censor certain transactions if they see transactions coming from within China. They'd
Control
be
the
able to do that.
blockchain. You own the majority of it, so you can control what gets put in and what doesn't. Yeah, we lose the decentralized nature of it essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But so it's important to realize though that it is extremely difficult. It's extremely cost ineffective. Maintaining that 51% attack is extremely
A lot of power.
cost. Yeah, it's exactly.
Electricity. I mean, yeah.
A lot of electricity, and getting all 51% together and having none of it, decide that they want to bail on that attack. That's extremely challenging. And so it's not something we've ever seen in Bitcoin. It's something we have seen in smaller chains. I think we've seen it in Ethereum Classic, in one of the Bitcoin Cash forks. But it's, as you get into sort of the real deal blockchains, the Ethereums, the Bitcoins, that's not something we've seen yet. And yeah, for the sole reason that the people involved in that attack, they are a lot more incentivized to just put that money directly into buying Bitcoin, right? Like they're going to make a lot more from that than trying to tear down this system.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that 51% in Bitcoin's case, Ethereum is moving to a proof of stake system, which we'll talk about in future episodes, where it requires 67% of the total supply of ETH. So there's different failure cases in different types of blockchains.
Cool.
So, Andrew, should I mine Bitcoin?
Another good one, and this is how you know things have gone mainstream, when you see your friends on Facebook that have never heard of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin asking, quote, how do I get a Bitcoin miner? This is probably not something you should get into at this point. 10 years ago, if you're a university student, you could probably do some cool stuff with some thumb drives and these little micro miners and all this jazz. Now it requires some serious computing power. They have hyper specialized processors that do nothing but solve these cryptographic algorithms. So they're completely useless for anything except mining Bitcoin. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, you have to continually upgrade them to stay cutting edge. And the technology grows like your computer. Like your cell phone now is way faster than the computer you were playing DOS games on when you were a kid by like orders of magnitude. Right? It's the same thing when it comes to these miners. So if you want to do it as purely hobbyist to understand the technology, cool, more power to you. It's an expensive hobby, but it can be interesting. I know a few people that do it on a hobbyist level. I've been there myself. If you're doing it to try to make money, you're better off just buying it and holding and looking at store value, because mining is it can be a trap, and a lot of people have lost a lot of money. Yeah, probably not is the answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common criticism of Bitcoin because the fact that you or I can't really effectively join mining is, in a way, a form of centralization that has occurred over time. It is now only institutional players that can afford that barrier to entry, which is why chains like Ethereum have stuck to mining primarily using graphics cards, consumer hardware that you can go down
irritating gamers around the world. Why can't I get my 1080s? Oh man,
I've been trying to buy a new graphics card for months for this exact reason, and I have been incapable of doing that. But yes, so there are alternatives if you want to get into it in a cost-effective way, mining Ethereum and other blockchains, but probably not Bitcoin.
Yeah. So, and maybe this last question here segue into a future episode, but what else can you do with the blockchain besides money? Is it useful for other storage of data?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's worth highlighting the fact that the concept of this consensus mechanism that converts decentralization into trust, that's great for money, but you can apply that concept to anything, to really the entire internet. You can build applications that are built on this foundation of trust. This is sort of a new frontier of for the internet. For that reason, it's the first time that we've had um, open public data like state on the internet that is entirely borderless, open, neutral, censorship resistant, and it can't be coerced in the same way that previous versions of applications on the internet have been capable of. So I think money is sort of the first application of the blockchain, similar to the way that email was the first application on the internet, right? Like email allowed us to communicate with anyone in the world, didn't matter where you were.
And we got instant
And
messaging and all these other things that grew
yeah,
on top of it. Okay. All right.
it flattened the world and it allowed us to build a lot more interesting things on top of that over time. And I think blockchains in a similar way. I think we're seeing money as really this first important innovation that's occurring in Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of these other cryptocurrencies. But I really do think that this is sort of the beginning toward this move. Web 3.0 is sort of the name, the label that's being applied for this movement toward decentralizing the internet and creating this new foundation and creating these new applications that can be trusted, that don't rely on companies selling your data. And yeah, it's interesting. I'm excited to talk more about it.
Rideshare was that example that we use, or this idea of no Uber, no Lyft, just peers connecting with other peers, drivers and riders somehow connecting together in this interface. That's the kind of Web 3.0 future. We don't have it quite fleshed out. Like, well, what happens if they throw up in my car? I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Just saying that is a theoretical, cool application of data rather than money of how these kind of trust systems could potentially be applied. Voting, to throw another one out there, that blockchain could have really cool implications with voting. That's something else we'll talk about in the future. So, lots to think about, but thank you for joining us for another episode here. Kevin, my friend, always a pleasure. Folks, you probably know where to find us by now, but if you're a new listener and you made it this far, thank you. Please follow, subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, all those places. You can find it, ZyoriTV as well. That's the website where you can subscribe for all the audio. But until next time, Kevin, we'll see you, bud.
Good chatting with you.